Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining us because once again we have with us Savannah Dominich, Ohio Wesleyan University student, an all-around great human being who has been sharing and talking with us about legacy environmental injustice. Savannah, how are you doing today?
I am doing A-okay today. It's a bit rainy where I'm at, but staying dry with my umbrella.
Very nice, very nice. You know, last week in South Carolina we had snow.
Oh.
So that was very different for all of us down here. We didn't know what to do, how to drive. We didn't know what to do with schools. Should we close? 2-hour delay, work from home. And so there was a lot of confusion. And so I'm glad you're dry. I survived the snow in South Carolina, so we're all here, and it's a good thing.
Yes.
And so last time we were together, we spent a lot of time talking about Kodak specifically. The company, its background, its history, the way it kind of infused itself with the community, and ultimately its downfall, its bankruptcy, and what it's become now that their products aren't as popular and they kind of didn't pivot well in a business sense. But on this episode, I understand that you want to say a little bit more about the community in Rochester, not just the factory itself, not just its kind of engagement directly, but the community as a whole. So tell us some of the things that you want us to know about Rochester that you think you may not have given us on the previous episodes.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the previous episodes, I've focused more on, stories. I think stories are great for some people, but I also find that, sometimes also, for example, statistics can also be helpful when trying to understand the community. So I look back at, the 2020 census from the U.S. Census Bureau, which anytime I always, look at the Census Bureau data, I gotta keep a few things in mind. One, you're missing tons of people, especially sometimes people who live in cities. They don't feel comfortable answering the survey. They don't know how to fill it out properly, all types of things. Never mind you, it was COVID time, and it's one of those times the whole census was all wonky and everything got extended, yada yada. But what I try to look at Rochester is one, from from the previous census, we see that the overall population of the city is declining, which not entirely surprising. A lot of people are moving more into the suburbs nowadays, but we also see a lot of statistics that are associated with, unfortunately, poverty in the city. So, for example, the median household income is 400. I'm sorry, is 44,000. Which 44,000? I mean, it's something, but it's not like a ton. In addition, we see that while 71% live in a family household, only 18% of family households are married. So the rest of the family households are single. And I have total respect for the single moms out there, the single dads out there, but it kind of it's really hard to be a single parent sometimes, to be a single caregiver, solely because, you're caring for all these people. You have one children, two children, three children, all on one income. And it's so hard because I know my parents wanted to give me opportunities to, maybe do a little after school activity, but if there's nobody to pick me up after school because, they're working, they're using on opportunities. And then also continuing on poverty, Rochester, the child poverty rate is 40%, which is the fifth highest in the nation among cities of its size, which is just huge. And it's just very sad to see that. And then we also see, unfortunately, reflecting this child poverty rate is the fact that in 2020, only 57% graduated from high school, which, I mean, for me, that's really, really concerning. Because I don't know if it's maybe they'll go back and get their GED someday, but a lot of companies will at least want a high school diploma for you to work for them. I think sometimes McDonald's will not want you if you don't have your your GED, and I think that really limits your employment opportunities as well in the city. And in addition, I think about, who lives in the city. What are the demographics? So demographically, it's 38% Black or African American per Census Bureau, which means we have an overrepresentation of people, essentially, which is not surprising. It's a city, after all, And then But no, 42% is like white alone, so not like white and Hispanic, for example, which
Mhm.
is lower than the average. Again, not surprising. But it's just like all these statistics. The reason I say them is just because like I think sometimes it can be hard just to like comprehend a whole city based on a story, like I was doing earlier. But these statistics can really help
Mhm.
you to realize like, oh, like 1 out of 2 people almost don't graduate high school, or only like what is it, 2 out of 10 people live in a household with more than one parent or guardian, which is like
Mhm.
shocking, at least to me. I mean, I'm not like an urban studies expert by any matters, but for me, like, this is very concerning. A home ownership rate of like less than 40%, not great either. And I think it's through these like statistics, and ultimately we also see like the change over the years as well that we see, unfortunately, with the exceptions of like the very, very gentrified areas, the quote unquote nice upcoming areas, if you will, that these demographics are shifting to be unfortunately poorer. So, like the community is ultimately, the city as a whole is ultimately, becoming poorer. And we see, as a result, we see white flight, due to,
Mhm.
they can move to the suburbs. We got plenty of suburbs. And then also just the city school district outcomes. I mean, I've had plenty of friends who are like, I don't want to go to, the Rochester City School District schools because they're not great. So, my parents can afford me to put me in like, maybe it's a charter school, maybe it's a nice like little private school. But like, every parent wants the best for your kids. I know that you're a parent and you don't want your kid to go to like a really, really bad school with no resources and stuff like that.
Mm-mm.
And yet, this is what we have in the city.
Oh, that's interesting. Um, there was a lot there. So, for those of you listening, you know that we talk a lot about what we would call environmental justice communities. This is the idea that there are places that are vulnerable because of their different demographics, because of their economic standing, because of a lot of different aspects of the community itself. It leaves the population there vulnerable to exploitation, to environmental harm, to injustice of various forms. And so, what it sounds like is Rochester is, if they're not, they're quickly approaching environmental justice community status, because it sounds like you have an overrepresentation of people of color, you have higher poverty rates, you have failing school systems, um, so many different components that would lead us, someone like me, to believe that, hey, if we're not paying close attention and really focused in on what's happening there, they could be very vulnerable to environmental harm and damage. And so that is very good context to have when we talk about Kodak and we talk about these different facilities in this city, because their harm and their pollution would disproportionately impact people in this type of community versus other places who have more resources and more opportunities to protect themselves and care for their families. I want you to say more about this, because we talk a lot about redlining and how redline communities are communities where only certain people could live there because they wouldn't give loans out. And there was this whole system in place to basically segregate the cities and the communities to ensure that more affluent whiter Americans got the best. But you make a note here in my notes about yellow lining and red lining. So can you talk more about what that is? Because I think that's a little bit different than what I've seen and read about.
Yes. So I found a map from the 1930s. I try to find something that's a more recent, but it's very hard to even find that in the first place.
Mhm.
So redline communities are typically like, the worst of the worst. Don't ever give anybody a loan to live there. So yellow lining is basically a step above redlining community, like redline community. So it's like this isn't a great community to live in. It's rapidly degrading. That's what the statistics would call it. So in this
Mm.
1930s map, you have your green line community. So like, wow, the top notch, great to live here. You have your blue line community. So it's like pretty nice to live here, but like it's like eh. And then you have yellow line, just like we're rapidly degrading. One day it will become a red line community. Things are falling apart, kind of thing. And then we of course have those red line communities. So seeing like the area surrounding Kodak Park, we see there is like these yellow line communities are directly next to Kodak Park. Typically, it's because it's like they said. I was reading the descriptions. It's like the pride of ownership is non-existent. To quote this map that I found. And in addition, it also found a lot of like things where it's like there are too many Italians living here, or there's too
Wow.
many black people living here. Like,
Mhm.
literally, those statistics would be right there, and it's like foreigners too many. And then we see also beyond these yellow line communities, which directly border Kodak Park, we see the red line communities right next door over. So my theory, at least, I can't confirm this. I wasn't alive in the 1930s, obviously. Is that
No.
these communities are yellow line because it's like, well, you live right close to your work site, kind of thing. So you have a little bit of, you can just like walk right over to your work site. So it's just a little preferable because of that. And then for those red
Mhm.
line communities, it's like you don't live next to it, and the only reason those other communities were even like yellow to begin with was because like maybe like commutability. You guys, terrible. For example, like one of the communities was like it said it was like 75% black, which is like it was like
Wow.
terrible. It's like so they're
Mhm.
all pretty much all living right there. And I do have to like give a little like I guess context. So in the 1930s, the entire population of Rochester was only like 1 or 2% black actually.
Oh, that's
From what I
interesting.
could tell. So
Uh-huh.
a lot of this like redlining grant you is because you know we have these other foreign groups like the Italians that we don't want. Of course, there are black folks as well who are making these communities undesirable, so-called undesirable.
Mhm.
But and then we see like I looked at like I overlaid this map currently, and I'm like these are basically the exact neighborhoods that exist today, and actually the predominantly 75% black community back then. It's like the upcoming arch district, if you will. It's predominantly white nowadays. They've all been either kicked out, pushed out, moved out, and now they're living actually in those more yellow line communities nowadays.
Oh, that's interesting. Would you say okay, so let me get the hierarchy right. So there's green line, blue line,
Hmm.
yellow line, red line.
Correct.
And so when you have Kodak Park, so we talked about last time how huge this park was. I think it's like 4 miles, about 4 miles. It was huge. It had its own infrastructure, its own. You said it was like a little city inside the city. Are you saying that the communities that were directly adjacent to Kodak Park were yellow lined?
Yes.
Okay, and then communities that were further away from those yellow line communities were red lined. Where were the blue and green line communities in relation to Kodak Park? Were they just far away, or were there certain parts of the city where they were better placed? Because I imagine part of the reason that they were yellow line and red line was because of their proximity to the pollution that the park was emitting, right? Because if you know there's smoke coming, you're not going to want to live near it. And so I wonder if that was part of the way that they kind of decided what neighborhoods would be lined in which color.
Definitely. So it's actually interesting. So directly south of Kodak Park is actually a blue line community. I thought that was
Oh.
interesting, but it makes sense. So if you think about the direction of the wind, like due to like the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, what have you, wind predominantly blows to the east, which means all that pollution should be going to the east. So going to the south, yeah, on occasion, rarely. But we also like you'd also see this in like the asthma level. So for example, like the east asthma levels is like in the 98th percentile in the U.S., while in like the west of Kodak Park, we're looking at like mid 80s, which is like grant you still not great for asthma, but it's a lot better compared to like being in the 98th percentile in the entirety of the U.S., which
Mhm.
suggests to me that like we have a bigger pollution problem because it's causing health issues. Toxic, it's just the air is like super high in the east, not as high in the west. In addition to like where those blue and green line communities are, they're actually past the Genesee River. So if you recalled earlier, I said the University of Rochester lives to the east of the river. Those
That's right.
communities were blue and green line. So, and there's a few other areas as well, but it's more like if you live like right on the lake, for example, it was like green line. But I guess that's because you can have your nice beachfront home or whatever. And
Mhm.
yay,
Yeah,
nice community.
you're by the water, of course. The water always pushes up the value of anything. So, yeah, I was curious about that when I saw the different colored communities. I just have not seen that kind of stratification so specific in the city. So that was interesting. I'm glad you shared that context too, because it does help. Because there is this kind of basic understanding that, hey, big facility, nobody wants to live near it. It must all be redlined and, you know, left for dead. But in this place, since this community was so embedded with Kodak Park and with Kodak as an entity, it would make sense that there would be some aspects that would be more desirable than others. Very, very interesting. And so, with that being said, let's talk about the pollution, the specific ways in which Kodak as an entity harmed the environment around its facilities in the city of Rochester, the people that live nearby. Tell us about the pollution.
Definitely. So I think the first thing I gotta do, and even though it's not the funnest thing to do on a podcast, is some definition work. So I know in the past I've talked about, methylene chloride. I think most people are like, oh, chloride, put chloride in your pool. There's sodium chloride for your table salt. But
Mm-hmm.
methylene chloride is so it's a solvent which, when mixed with cellulose acetate, becomes a liquid which is turned into film. So essentially, it could be like part of that like little like gelatin layer with like the silver halide crystals, and when you expose it to film, it like makes it like an image kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So very, very common in film because it's actually what makes film film. So super commonly used. And then another, it's not really a chemical, it's more of a element, if you will. It's silver.
Mm-hmm.
So silver, silver coins way back in the day. So the silver was used to make the silver halide crystals, part of the Johnson emotion, the late image, determine the contrast and like the resolution of the image. Silver,
Mm-hmm.
however, is, a toxic metal when it's present in too high of quantities, which is what we started to see the problems with because you might have like, like touching a strip of film isn't gonna like give you like silver poisoning, but like day after day, month after month, year after year, yeah, touching the silver is the concern. And then the final definition I'll give is something called dioxin.
Mm-hmm.
Dioxin particularly came from the incinerators of Kodak, so we're burning off all the other chemical products. Dioxin, depending on who you talk to, has sometimes been called like the deadliest man-made chemical. It
Mm-hmm.
is carcinogenic, and like anytime I ever see something that's like says carcinogenic, like it told me that it's like really dangerous because to like get that classification, it takes like a lot of work to even get that. Because like
Mm-hmm.
well, it could be potentially be it because we're not certain. No, they're certain this is carcinogenic. They know it can cause developmental problems. They know it damages the immune system. They know it can interfere with hormones. So there's no question that this is like toxic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I guess like to start off with, like I think about like so there's two different pollution. I would say we have the specific instances, and then like the I'll call it the day to day stuff. Like it happens every day. So for the instances, I know in the past we talked about like the methylchlorine pipe spill in 1998. I'm sorry, 1988.
88,
1988.
right, 88.
88. Me, my number is not the greatest. But in 1988, so expelled, 30,000 gallons of, methylene chloride by elementary school, less than like 1,000 yards away. So pretty close. Obviously sent the whole school home for the day.
Okay, wait,
And then
hold
we
on. Hold on. That was a spill near an elementary school?
Yes, near an elementary school. So, because there was
So
so the, go
so
ahead.
they could see the spill, like they could see the chemicals coming from the plant while they're at the school, coming like what, like oozing towards them? Like what is happening here?
So the pipes. So there's 20 schools within like a 3 mile radius of the plant to begin with. So essentially, my understanding is you got a bunch of pipes, working throughout the community to direct it to different like the wastewater treatment plant was actually more to like the bottom of like the Kodak Park facility. So you
Mm-hmm.
gotta like send those chemicals through the pipes. Obviously, the school was close enough to that pipe, which one open, and then you can see like, oh, walks in the parking lot. Uh-oh, kind of
Oh
thing.
wow. Oh my goodness.
So,
Okay.
and needless to say, a lot of people started to move out after that because it's like when you're like contaminating your kid's school place with a bunch of chemicals is not the greatest at all.
No, it's
Um,
not.
and then the next year, I think we also talked about it, the 1989 vapor cloud. So it was caused by I got the name of the chemical, but it is 34 letters long, and I can't pronounce it. So we're gonna move on past that. It's kind of like when you read those like food labels, and it's like if you can't pronounce it, you probably shouldn't be eating it, kind of things. Kind of
Mhm.
one of those deals, probably. And so, right, the 3 mile square, radius around the plant, we had to shut down the highways, emergency broadcast system was activated. And then
Wow.
the more new stuff as well. It's like, so in 1995, they had like a faulty vent at like one of the like incinerators, which released 30 tons of solvent. Not sure which one, the reports don't say, into the air. But in that 30 tons was 10 tons of methylene chloride right into the air over a period of 7 months. So grant you, it took them a while to figure out, oh, we have a faulty vent and we're spewing chemicals everywhere. And then 2 years later, this is not an isolated incident. We have another, faulty scrubbing system, and we get a ton of methylene chloride into the air in just 6 hours. So that was called a
Wow.
little faster because it's like rapid spewing out. And these are just like the really noticeable incidences. So
Mhm.
Kodak
Mhm.
had an average of 100 accidental spills and releases every single year. So these are just like the big ones that like, made the news, if you will. The little like, oh, we spilled 5 gallons here. It's like not super noticeable, like notable, but like
Mhm.
these things still do have impacts. And
Yeah.
then I guess the final thing I'll say about the instances is, so the EPA was founded in 1970, right? And
Right.
then the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act was founded 16 years later in 1986. Without like these like the EPA or like this like Right to Know Act, I really wonder if we would have even known about like these like faulty vents, these chemical spills, because really like the history only like dates a couple years after like this Right to Know Act was passed. So I'm like, what happened beforehand? I can't like I have a hard time believing that
Oh.
like the first issue was in 1988 and then like we had all these issues afterwards. For me, I think there was things before this like Right to Know Act was passed that happened, but it was like you don't have the right to know, so we don't have to tell you, kind of thing. So it's like, what
Oh
are we
man.
missing as well?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So that speaks a lot to the need for enforcement, the need for an actual protection agency, someone who actually holds, to the best of their ability, people accountable for what they're doing to the environment. And so I completely agree with you. There's no way that this plant's been in operation since when? Since the 70s or before then?
1896.
Oh, since the 1800s.
Yes.
And then the first time they have a major incident is in 1988. And then 89, and then 95, and then 97. No, it's been happening clearly for a very long time. And so, for all of you listening, we are fortunate in the US to have an agency that actually does that monitoring and has that right to know act embedded into its law so that we actually have the right to know. Like, you can't hide and you can't conceal the ways in which you are harming the community and the environment around us. And those are just specific instances. Those are just major kind of news breaking spills and accidents that have occurred. But you were about to tell me, before I cut you off, you were about to tell me that they have just, what, is it just like everyday spills and just common part of operating is just making a mess everywhere we go, like on a daily basis? Like, tell me about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I definitely think like every day we make a mess, if you will. So wait, Kodak was New York State's #1 source for toxicants and neurotoxins, like releases for in the state for a very, very long time, up until 2000 actually. And
Whoa.
I even like to think that like, so from 1987 to 2000, so in general, Rochester, which consisted of Kodak and a couple other companies as well, was #1 in the entire U.S. for carcinogenic releases.
Oh,
Woohoo!
oh
That's
my
not what we
God.
celebrate. Not at all. It's really, really bad. And even like, the problem is like, even after 1987, Kodak's business is starting to decline, but yet
Hmm.
they're still pumping out all these chemicals. They still are showing that they don't care. I was reading an article from, it was actually like a student newspaper, and it was talking about how Kodak wanted to increase its permits to they continue with emissions, basically so they could emit more. This was in the early 2000s, mind you. They wanted to limit the monitoring of emission sources because it was too costly, and they wanted to limit the community's ability to hold them accountable. So,
Wow.
so it's like, ugh, it's like terrible. Like this is like environmental injustice, like awful.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
it's not just like inside, like outside of the facility. It's also inside of it. I think in the past, I know we talked about like asbestos. So like we had asbestos in the drywall, the insulation, the cement, the heat and chemical clothes that they're supposed to be wearing to protect themselves, the gloves,
Mm-hmm.
the pumps, the turbines, the everything. So asbestos, you get it on your clothes, you take it home with you, and then all of a sudden your house is contaminated with it. Now we
Mm-hmm.
got mesothelioma, and it's no surprise that like if you were to Google Rochester, New York, one of the Reddits that there is out there. So for those who don't know, Reddit's like a like kind of like sub forum that people can like post and talk about things on it. Is every few years you'll see like, "Hi, I'm moving into the community. I'm worried about cancer and safety." Which I mean, they have every right to be worried about cancer and safety
Mm-hmm.
given all the stuff that's going on. At least in my opinion, a lot of the harm that Kodak has done is like they're not like actively like polluting the skies anymore
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that it used to be. So it's not much of a risk, but it just shows you that like people like moving into this community were like, I don't want to get cancer, which is totally fair. No one wants to get cancer. And then in addition, like besides what I would call like these like just like general like neurotoxins, toxic releases, we also have methyl chloride releases, right? So I talked about that. So the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which is kind of like the state version of the federal Environmental Protection Agency kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They said we don't want this release of this chemical to be any more than zero point 0.6 parts per billion because that's like the minimum risk level. So if something's higher than that, you're at risk for like getting like the negative effects associated with methylcooling chloride. They did a bunch of air monitoring outside the community, and they found like the ambient rate of this was 23 parts per billion, which is a lot higher than zero point 0.6 parts per billion. So they're literally breathing unsafe air of these communities every single day while the factory was like in its full production mode, which is like just shocking to me.
Okay, so wait, hold on. So the minimum set by the state agency was zero point 0.6.
The minimum risk level. So like if it's
The
above,
minimum risk level.
yes,
Okay, the minimum risk level is zero point 0.6. So what they're saying is above zero point 0.6, you're at risk for the impacts that methyl chloride has. Below zero point 0.6 is okay.
correct.
At the fence, it was 23,
23, yes.
and it was consistently 23. It wasn't like something happened and it spiked up to 23 and came back down later. It was
No,
just
it
that's what it
on
was.
average, yes, on
It's an
average. I mean,
average.
yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, you say average, so it could be higher one day, lower another day, but average it was 23, which I mean, for those of you who are counting, I mean, I can do math. I mean, that's like 30, 40 times higher than what the level is that's set by the state. And so is Kodak or was Kodak allowed to operate at that level? Like, was there no repercussions for having air quality that bad consistently around the plant?
Unfortunately, not really. It was more like, oh, please fix it, please. They were fined a few times, like you have a few $1,000s here, $1 million there.
Well, yeah.
But the thing is, when you're like a very very rich company, which I obviously I don't know the estimated worth of Kodak. And then you have to also account for inflation, if you will. But I would say like they'd be what we call a $1 billion company. $1 million is like a
Yeah, it's
expensive
nothing.
holiday party.
It's a tax write off. I mean, it's not much at all. So, oh my goodness. So we have Kodak as the state's leading neurotoxin emitter. At some point, you were number one in the country in emitting neurotoxins out of Rochester, New York. And we have a methylene chloride level that's light years above the minimum risk level set by the state, which, for those of you who don't know, the states aren't always the most progressive in terms of their regulatory policies. And so it's not as though this was this hard line meant to really ensure highest quality risk level. This is just the minimum. It's like just please, if you can get to this, we'd appreciate it. This is the minimum that we would require, we would ask of you, and they still shot way past it. And so, what does that do to the community, their health, their well-being, their quality of life? Like, how would you describe, or what have you learned about how these ways of operating has impacted them on a day-to-day basis?
Definitely. So one thing that's really noticeable in this community is the high levels of childhood brain and spinal cancer, which is not
Whoa.
surprising as it interferes with, your brain. And, it's a very unusual cancer. Between 1976, they try to get, like, there was a lawsuit that happened, so they try to get a tally of how many, children have been affected. And they found
Mm-hmm.
that, like, 68 had been affected within a span of, like, 20 years, which is, like, but it's kind of odd. Grant you, when they did their full investigation, like in an 18-month investigation, they went, there is no possible way that methylene chloride, impacted these kids and gave them cancer.
Right.
Which is like cancer cluster studies are just very difficult, because it's very hard to prove a cancer cluster to begin with. First of all, you
Mm-hmm.
need a big enough sample size, which we may not have had a big enough sample size. Cancer can have a latency period spanning years, even decades, and it's also just really hard to prove because of an environmental factor.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and there was a lawsuit that was brought by the families of 6 kids with cancer, one of whom unfortunately died pretty quickly, and unfortunately nothing came out of that. But it also like makes you think about like why didn't like more people like say anything about this? And the best answer that I can find is people were afraid of Kodak. They're like, this is a huge employer of the community. We're a company town. They give us jobs. They give us insurance. And yeah, some kids got sick, and it's very sad. But it's like we're not willing. We as lawyers aren't willing to take on the risk of taking on this big, powerful company, who we probably have used. They've probably been our client before. So we don't
Mm-hmm.
want to like do that and like harm our reputation or anything. And then even I think the Department of Health. So if the U.S. Department of Health released some like cancer maps as well, how like show that like, hey, the cancer isn't as bad, people. They actually inadvertently, by trying to hide the fact that the cancer was bad, did show that it was above levels. The
Mm-hmm.
challenge, what they did is in their cancer maps, they emitted the cancers that are associated with the chemicals emitted by Kodak, and they also emitted the cancers that were of concern to parents who have like kids living near the park. So essentially, they took out the cancer that we actually like, say, like care about, if you will, and had all
Right.
the other ones. So then it's like, oh, you know what, you're doing okay because we put completely different cancers and these chemicals are affecting. Even still, though, it was shown that like these cancer rates for like the county, the city, were higher than the average, even though they were trying to like hide this information by purposely excluding certain cancers and then using what they call like broad gradation. So instead of like, if you live in this area, you have like a 10% chance, between like 0 and 10% chance, 10 and 20%. They purposely made those gradations like 20 and 40
Oh, I see
or
what you mean. Yep.
40 and 60 kind of thing. So that way
Mm-hmm.
it's like it could be 40 or it could be 60, but you don't know because it's all like aggregated data. And typically
Mm-hmm.
they would do that 10%. So it's like for me, it's like they're clearly trying to hide something. Um, I'm sure that this somebody benefited by that information being hidden, whether it was definitely it was Kodak, but maybe also somebody at the state who was in like Kodak's pockets kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, we got sick and dying children because of that. We also have sick women because of that. Like there's higher pancreatic cancer rates in Rochester, New York, for example. And I think about it, like Kodak did a study and they found that their own workers were likely to have high risk of pancreatic cancer because of their exposure to methylene chloride. This got published in the Journal of Occupational Medicine. But the
Wow.
thing is, like, it's it's very difficult sometimes to corroborate like a workplace harm where you're being exposed to like this much of it because you work with it directly every day, and then the environmental harm. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that connection was never made. But like women are twice as likely to get pancreatic cancer than in Rochester, New York, than anywhere else in the rest of the county, as in like Monroe County, which is where Rochester resides.
It's interesting that you talked about the fact that women in particular had higher cancer rates in Rochester than parts of the county. I wonder if there are other very specific disproportionate impacts from Kodak. Do you think that there are? I know you talked about cancer in women. Obviously, if you live close to the plant, you're exposed more, you have more possibilities for issues. And then, of course, this childhood brain and spinal cord cancer. I've never heard that before. Obviously, it's in children. Is there anything else that you can think of that you remember reading about that may have stood out in terms of some of these impacts?
Yeah, so I do think about like furthermore, like, there's a high level also thyroid cancer, also in women as well. So
Mm,
I'm not sure if maybe there's something like gender going on here, but like young girls especially are more likely to have a like higher risk of thyroid cancer or to get it. In addition, it's also like neuropathy and then like diabetes as well. It's like a common element in this community as well. Though this
mhm.
like neuropathy and diabetes is more associated with dioxin than with methylene. And the
Oh,
reason we only know, sorry, go, you gonna
no,
say
no, go
something?
ahead. No, go ahead. We haven't talked about dioxin yet, so go ahead and talk about dioxin too and what it does.
Definitely. So dioxin was coming from these incinerators, and they were just piling, like pewing out of them. So I found this one really interesting quote from it was the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, and it was like a 1992 trial burn of Kodak's incinerators released more dioxin into the environment than all of New York's other tested environmental hazardous waste incinerators combined. One incinerator is greater than every other incinerator in the entirety of New York State.
Wow.
That is like, whoosh, mind blowing, if you will.
Mhm.
And I did some math. So their incinerators release 544 million adult doses of dioxin a year. So like what we like kind of like safe, the maximum amount of safeness. And so if every New Yorker during the height of Kodak, which was about 17 million according to the census that I looked at, took an equal share of their dioxin, each person would approximately receive 30 times more than the EPA's acceptable dose. And that's the
Mm,
entirety of New York State. Now, if we boil that down to just who's living in Rochester at that time, which was about 280,000 people, that's a huge amount of unacceptable levels of dioxin. And the reason
mhm.
the dioxin is also attributed to thyroid cancers and pancreatic cancers, as well as, diabetes and neuropathy. And the reason that we have suspicions that it is in fact dioxin causing these health issues is if you like think way back to like Agent Orange back in the day, the main ingredient in Agent Orange is dioxin actually. And they have
Mhm.
the citizens of Rochester, New York, near Kodak Park had the same exact ailments, if you will, than like the Vietnam veterans who were exposed to it. So it's like this interesting connection where you can see like we have two groups with the same exact symptoms and they're both exposed to the same exact chemicals. It's most likely dioxin that's causing it. You can't like obviously submit somebody to the unethical and like experimentation of like let's give you a bunch of dioxin and see what happens to you. But we can say there's a very very good correlation between the two.
Wow. Wow. The same chemical, the same outcome that we saw in the Vietnam War is happening in Rochester, New York at this time. That's wild and crazy. And you're right. I mean, there's no getting around that reality. You can't weasel your way out. You can't talk your way out of that one. I know people like to say, causation and correlation aren't the same thing, but in this case, there's too much evidence to suggest that's what's happening there. And so these chemicals and these releases and this exposure, is this all airborne? Is it in the water? Is it how are people physically exposed to these chemicals? Just by breathing the air, or is it drinking water in other parts of their environment that they're exposed to? What do you think? What do you think?
So it's I would say mostly airborne. So like we know the methylene chlorine was airborne. The dioxin was definitely airborne because that was just dioxin was primarily only from the incinerators.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have concerns like for example you mentioned like was it in the water. So we know the water was polluted with soil, both the Genesee River and also the ground a little bit of the groundwater. So the Genesee River flows directly into Lake Ontario, which is one of the five major Great Lakes, so Huron, Superior, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario, and it
Mhm.
provides the drinking water for the community. And we know that the river in some areas had sediments, that were testing as high as like 100 ppm for silver. So too high for consumption. However, obviously in the US at least, we like, as you know, we treat, lake water before we go to drink it. So
Mhm.
I do not know the extent to which, treating that drinking water was removing all that silver that was like coming out of the river, then flowing into the lake. But it's likely to say that there was definitely probably an elevated risk of silver in like people's drinking water as well. The key concern for the silver in the Genesee River was more about like the fish. Could the fish
Mhm.
were accumulating the silver, and then you have like, you have some like local fisher people who are, fishing it, and it's like you can't be eating your fish, or it's
Right.
like, please only have one fish every month, no more.
Mhm.
And like for me, like if I can only eat something like once a month, I shouldn't be having that at all. That's just my opinion. I know some people like really are passionate about eating the fish they catch though. And then they did thankfully like repair the river. They dredged up all of that like silver contaminated sediment. But I think for me, at least, when I see this, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation was the lead on removing the silver because the river had a bunch of like beneficial uses, had a bunch of ecosystem services. So I can find out a ton of information about like cleaning up the river of its silver because it's not coming from Kodak, which was responsible for many of its other cleanup that had to happen. This was
Mhm.
pretty much spearheaded by the New York State. And then furthermore, even though what Kodak paid for half of the river, they paid 49 million for the river. Taxpayers had to foot the other 49 million because the EPA was not convinced that the 49 million that Kodak contributed via its trust fund was going to be enough for cleaning everything up. So they had to dip into some lovely taxpayer funded money.
Oh goodness. Goodness gracious. So, okay, so all this pollution is happening. All these places are being contaminated. Now, the average person would say, "Sure, Savannah, Dr. Joseph, we hear what you're saying, but you said last week that the plant's gone and that the pollution stopped. So mission accomplished, right? I mean, although it took this long time, people were exposed and had these issues. We've gotten rid of the facility. We've removed the pollution sources. We've eliminated these discharges and these spills and this consistent ongoing operation that was harming the environment. So we should be fine, right?" And so I would say, of course, no, this is the legacy environmental justice series. So clearly there's more to the story. And so, how would you describe the legacy that was left behind from Kodak, the pollution that they've just dumped into this community for so long? And what do you think should happen next as a result of knowing all this about what's happened?
Definitely. So I would say first of all that this a lot of the pollution they made further with the river. They cleaned up the river in 2021, which is 9
Oh.
years after Kodak went bankrupt. So it's not like it was like, oh, but next year everything's all fixed and ready to go. People were still suffering from the effects of that river being contaminated for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, while the river was able to be cleaned up, not all of the pollution was able to be cleaned up. I believe in the past we've talked about, the groundwater pollution. It was polluted with methanol, benzene, ethyl benzylenes, petroleum, methylchlorine, of course, right? The levels of methylchlorine concentrations in the groundwater were found to be as high as 3,600,000 parts per billion. The legal limit is 5, which is, yeah, 720,000 times greater than the legal limit. And I
Wow.
know, like, I know you're an engineer, and so, like,
Yeah.
basically they put, like, a bunch of, like, infrastructure in place to make sure it never leaves. I'm sure you probably know more about, like,
Mm-hmm.
little pumps, hydraulic pumps, routing certain little basins, aquifers, liners to make sure it never seeps in to, like, the underneath aquifer contaminating everything. But they can't fix the groundwater. It's too bad. It's too bad to fix it, which is I think
Mm-hmm.
of course very important. You can't remediate it because they were one. directly putting chemicals into the groundwater because like, oh, it's under our feet, it's gone. Like problem solved. And
Mhm.
we also had like leaking sewer line pipes that were like just like leaking chemicals everywhere, kind of like with the elementary school. But it was more like a slow leak, so you're not gonna notice it because it's like not huge.
Oh, I forgot about that. So the actual piping systems were still in place. Like, they left them there
They're
with
still
whatever
there
was
to
inside
this
them, they're
day.
still there.
They're still there.
Oh, wow. Are there plans to deal with that? To remove those polluted pipes?
No, from my understanding, it's just like it's not even money for long-term monitoring, honestly. So it's more like let's just fix the big issues, and then the long-term monitoring that can be whoever decides to like have their building there next. They can deal with a little pipe work under their plant, which is, I think, incredibly problematic because if you still have these pipes underneath there, who knows what they're doing? Grant
Mhm.
you, like, I'm sure somebody's making sure that, like, the water stays contained, but it's probably still getting, I believe, it's probably still getting more contaminated to this day just because they only cleaned up the big things. They only cleaned up the contaminated soil, the contaminated river. They obviously shut down their incinerators because they, closed up shop. But what about all these little tiny like small instances? So like that like forgotten chemicals sitting somewhere in the basement. For example, they found like at one point like weapons grade uranium sitting in their basement. Whatever things are in that basement. Whatever like waste dumps are like leaking. Kodak had its own waste dump on site. For me at least, just given their history, I'm inclined to believe that their liner on that waste dump is probably leaking into the groundwater as well, and no one's going to manage that because, well, Kodak's closed. The trust fund that I mentioned earlier for the river basically washed their hands of any environmental liability. It's all the trust fund's responsibility now. And once the trust fund is out of money, taxpayers, please come support us, kind of thing.
So, when they shut down and went bankrupt, all of the actual infrastructure stayed in place? So this dump site, the piping, storage units, all the things that they were using or that facilitated some of these contamination events just remained. And from what you're telling me, nobody's actually checking to see if they're still causing problems. They're just there and they're just hoping for the best, or is there an assumption about what's happening, or I don't understand it because they knew
Mm,
what was happening while they were in operation. There's no reason to believe that once they shut down, all of this infrastructure is going to be fine to leave in place because we know what it's holding and what it's leaking. And
mm.
so there's just there's just nothing, nobody anywhere doing anything.
So there is a company that has taken over part of the Kodak Park area. It's called Red Rochester, and they're mostly focused on the wastewater system. As well as
Okay.
power generation. So they've taken over like the wastewater system part of it, and like replaced a bunch of pipes for the wastewater. Obviously, sometimes chemical pipelines are not always the same thing as wastewater pipelines. I
Right.
try to like look on their website, and their website is so bland. It tells me absolutely nothing besides some nice, pretty videos. They are aware of some of the facilities I would say are no longer there. So there's plenty of videos online you can find of them imploding Kodak buildings. It's a great, great
Mhm.
video to watch if you need to watch something blow up, I guess. But I would say so. It depends on what area. So I think the groundwater, the EPA knows about it, so they're going to make sure that it stays contained. I don't think they care about that it gets more contaminated. It's just more like, oh, it's still in a
Oh.
facility kind of thing. For like the contaminated soil, their thing is we tried our best. We're gonna hope that's good. Like for example, like the river, they couldn't obviously get all the silver out of the river. They sealed the remaining silver inside the river. There is no plans to follow up to make sure that the river that seal on that silver in the river is not leaking. It's more like we did the best that we could. We cleaned it up according to the standards that be, and therefore it
Mhm.
is resolved. It is done because it is cleaned up. Never mind you that I believe some long-term monitoring would be very beneficial, but unfortunately the money's not there for that because I mean I understand the New York Department of Environmental Conservation does not want to pay for Kodak's mistakes. They don't want taxpayers to do it either. And since Kodak, they gave the $49 million that they agreed to, and that's gonna have to cut it.
Wow. No, I mean you're right. You're right. I mean, when somebody's looking at it from the outside, I mean, are we going to just spend money indefinitely to monitor something? The idea is that you clean it up so you don't have to monitor it anymore, but that was their approach. And for those of you listening who aren't familiar with these large facilities, Savannah is right. So when she says things like wastewater system, chemical system, what she's alluding to is the reality that on a site, you have different standards and different systems set up based on what your facility does and how it operates. So I imagine they have your standard wastewater system where you have just water from sinks and from bathrooms going down the drain into a typical wastewater treatment facility to get treated and cleaned up. But there's also chemical systems where you actually have to move the chemical around the plant. You have special piping that has to be up to certain codes to transport certain chemicals. You probably have process water systems where you have the hot water or the cold water that's used to kind of manage the cooling systems on site. It has its own system. All of these different systems are built differently, have different hazards associated with them, have different concerns for potential environmental contamination. And so you have to monitor and manage them differently. And the idea that a chemical plant would shut down and you're only concerned about the wastewater system, which is your basic generic wastewater that we all deal with, versus these industrial toxic carcinogens in these other systems that you're just leaving alone, says a lot about the priorities of whoever is making the decisions on how to move forward. And so that's disappointing. But it goes to the point earlier about the idea of legacy injustice, right? This is part of what we've been talking about, part of what we're seeing in the way that either Kodak is operating or the regulators or the people who are responsible for making decisions, they're not helping. And so, with that being said, what do you believe should happen to ensure people are protected from the legacy of this Kodak facility? We know about when it was in operations, what was going on. But now, if I'm a community, I mean, I'm not organizing against Kodak. They're not there anymore, right? I'm not talking about them reducing their pollution. They're not there anymore. So, what should people in those yellow line and red line communities be advocating for in terms of how to address this legacy issue?
Definitely. So I think there's a few categories. I think one could be like remediation. Another one would be like long-term monitoring, even like education as well. So for like remediation, like I think about like I would like to see some more like wetlands personally built. So a lot of Washington, New York actually used to be a wetland. New York State as a whole has lost over half of its historic wetlands due to filling and draining. So I think constructing some wetlands was really, really good for like one, filtering groundwater, and then also protecting the river from contaminated runoff could be great. It
Mm-hmm.
also might like solve some of the like that public contamination problem, while also helping to alleviate potentially new hazardous waste that is coming from the sites that have moved in since Kodak left. I think also I would like to like get like another opinion based on like what's going on, because the thing is there's only so many resources out there, and once the EPA did their part, they were pretty much kind of like hands off kind of thing. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it'd be great to understand like, okay, what is like the status of like, you know, the coolant like pipes that are going through the plants. What exactly is that? Because while we don't know like all the like really really bad corona that it's like imminent danger, or like, oh, I guess I have some corrosion that need to be replaced in like 5 years, kind of thing. We don't
Mm-hmm.
know the exact condition because it's like I said, nobody seems to like really care about it, or if they do care about it, they don't have the resources to like essentially show that care. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, just like try to find like the smaller sites. I am sure that Kodak left some like skeletons in their basement, if you will, skeletons in their closet that need to be cleaned up. But the thing is, who's going to pay for that is the issue. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the community needs to organize and be like, city council, Department of Environmental Conservation, whoever's going to listen, we want something to be done about this.
Mm-hmm.
And then for like, you know, we talked about monitoring. I would love to see some monitoring of silver in the river. Um, even like the groundwater that's like outside of the plant to ensure that contaminated water that is like living that contaminated groundwater that's like inside the boundaries of Kodak Park is not escaping and
Mhm.
contaminating all this other groundwater. Grant you, I know a lot of people in the city do not use wells, but especially as you get into like the more like rural suburbs, it turns into well and
Mhm.
like aquifers, I'm sure as you know, for abuse can know, they can stretch miles and connect even totally different cities together because it's like one giant pot essentially. So I would hate to see that like pot that people are pulling for the well water to be contaminated. And then even if like having people just learn about the water in the community, like at least for like my like fifth grade curriculum, we learned a lot about like the history of one the Americas in general. Then we moved into like New York State and even like our own local area as well. I would love to see some history curriculums talk about. Oh, let's talk about like we all have like I referred to earlier, we're all proud that we're from the area that Kodak is from because they used to be known for something that was really important, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so maybe we could talk about like okay, and like here's also like what they left behind, so we can understand like the pluses and the minuses of industry. Just trying to get like a really nuanced view as well. There could even be things like I would like a newsletter, like a lot of these communities, some of them have associations already existing. A newsletter
Mhm.
to talk about like you know, here's the plant, here's how it's doing. The problem is where you're going to get this information from. And currently, there is really no place to get that information from, which is kind of the issue with like the newsletter. Like people don't know. People need to know about what's really going on
Mhm.
because but like, even like during my research, like, I looked at so many different sources, looked at different interviews. It just takes a lot of time to find out about what's going on. Now it's just like 30 something years in the past. And then I would also say make sure that's like have associations, community coalitions engaging with the new companies that have moved in as well. So while yes, Kodak might be gone, there's still new companies there that I think could of course be it could be beneficial for the company to have them under a watchful eye, if you will, to make sure they're properly maintaining their part of the grounds,
Mhm.
that there's no major issues going on. And ultimately, the goal is to try to prevent another giant, if you will, from filling Dakota X shoes. I don't think anybody could possibly do that in this day and age. But you don't even want like a baby giant. You don't want something at all. Finally, have those community accountability groups saying like we don't want toxic pollution in our community.
Mhm.
I grant you, it's probably still going to go somewhere, which is part of the issue of environmental justice. You can say, NIMBY, not in my backyard, and then it goes to somebody else's backyard who can't, afford to have it somewhere else, or they've been, historically discriminated against in terms of environmental pollution, and they have it in their backyard, while your backyard is nicer. Which it's really unfortunate that our capitalist society is so much into consuming things because I feel like if we consumed a lot less, we would not have all this crazy pollution. Like Kodak cameras were disposable, so you had to keep buying them. You had to keep buying the film. You can't reuse. You can't reuse the film. You got to keep making new film, and that means just endless pollution.
Yeah. Nope, you're absolutely right. It's a really in some ways it's complex, but in some ways it really isn't, right? I mean, there are very specific ways to make sure people are protected and safe from the legacy of a place like Kodak. And so I like all your suggestions. We're pushing up against an hour because if we had more time, right, we had more discussions about health and health care and equity in this community. We're going to do it next time, Savannah. We're going to do it next time. So before we go, though, is there anything else you want us to know? Anything you want to share that you may have thought about? Maybe you didn't know where to put it, where to discuss it. You can talk about it now.
Definitely. I like to think like even though currently like I'm like situated at Ohio Wesleyan University, I'm like 6.5 hour drive from Rochester, New York. It's like what can I do about the issue of like this legacy environmental justice pollution particularly? So like for me at least like I want to like get like a master's degree in like water resources management or environmental management. I want to do something that's like remediation planning and monitoring for these communities. Unfortunately, I have no training, so like I can't do that. But I think it'd be
Mhm.
like it'd be so amazing if like one day, like 10 years down the road, that like I could like do some monitoring on that site to see what's really going on there. I'm hoping that maybe somebody else will do it before I get, trained and off into like my bigger career, if you will.
Mhm.
But like even like being educated myself so I can try to help other communities, maybe not even my home community, who are suffering from these issues of left behind pollution. And then also like I referred to earlier, like consumerism, like buying things, like not buying things that like I don't need. Like I think back to it was like there was a giant like national action day of clean air for Kodak. People were protesting Kodak. They're like, we don't want to buy your film. We don't want to buy your other products that you sell. So to want to like think back to that as well, to be like, I don't support what you're doing, so therefore I'm not going to buy your product. Um, it gets it gets difficult because like for example, I know like in the past you talked about like Palestine issues on this podcast, like BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction. Like it's
Mhm.
very very hard to completely starve off Amazon or Google because they're like so deeply entrenched into everything. But
Mhm.
maybe like for smaller companies that like we can be like, okay, I'm not gonna buy your candy Hershey's kind of thing because like, I don't support what you're doing. And
Mhm.
it's also a lot of research that needs to happen. But I think like also like not just like buying things that like I don't need that are contributing to like this environmental justice harm in these communities. Also like
Mhm.
maybe like reusing things like I mean, you tear a pair of pants. You don't go buy a new. You should go buy a new pair of pants. You're like, maybe you can fix it. They're still tailors. I have a great tailor. Put some patches on my clothes, and you're off to the races. But I think it's also like a matter of not just like pointing the finger, being like, you guys didn't do that, you guys didn't do that, but also like pointing the thumb back at myself and going, well, what can I do? Obviously, when it comes to pollution, a lot of it unfortunately has already been done, and I can't like be like Mr. Peabody and Sherman and create a time machine, and fix this. But maybe I can, help to fix this after the solved problem, or try to help
Mhm.
to ensure that this doesn't happen to other communities.
Exactly. I mean, that's the kind of attitude and approach that we should all have, right? We all have the power to do something. We have the ability to make a difference one way or another, and I'm excited about what you're gonna be doing and how you're gonna be making a difference and an impact. And everybody listening too, I hope you're doing the same thing wherever you are. Just know that you do have agency, you do have the ability, the intellect to really make this world a better place for all of us. And so we should definitely do that. We are up on our time, and so Savannah, I want to thank you once again for taking this time, sharing your thoughts, your research, your perspective, your views, your advocacy, your activism. It's infectious, and I'm so thankful that you shared it with us on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been a complete pleasure.
Absolutely. So next time when we come back again, Savannah will give us some more discussion. I think we're going to talk about healthcare and talk about the community and how that's related to what's been happening there, but maybe something else. We'll see. I mean, I'm not sure, but I'm excited about it. And so, thank you all for listening to this episode of the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. We will see you next time.